The dust cloud rising from the valley floor told Phineas Lawson everything he needed to know about the scrawny cowhand trudging toward their camp that scorching June morning of 1873. But it was the way those shoulders squared themselves just a fraction too deliberately that made him pause while pouring his coffee. Most men carried their strength like they were born to it, all loose limbs and easy swagger. But this one moved like someone who had studied the part in a mirror and perfected every gesture until it looked natural enough to fool the untrained eye. Phineas was many things, but untrained was not one of them, and as the stranger got closer, he noticed the way the worn hat sat just a touch too low, the bandana tied just a fraction too high, the baggy shirt that hung in a way that suggested concealment rather than simple poor fit. "Looking for work," the stranger announced in a voice pitched carefully low, meeting Phineas's gaze with eyes the color of spring grass that held more determination than 100 men he had known. "Name's Lou Anders. Heard you were short-handed for the drive to Sacramento." Phineas took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the silence stretch out between them while he studied the delicate bone structure that no amount of dirt could fully disguise, the slender fingers that gripped the reins too tightly, the slight curve at the hip that the oversized vest almost managed to hide. He should have sent her packing right then and there, should have called her out on the charade and told her that a cattle drive was no place for a woman playing dress-up. But something in those green eyes stopped him cold. Desperation, yes, but also a fierce pride that reminded him of a wild mustang refusing to be broken, and beneath it all, a raw kind of courage that most men would never possess even if they lived 100 years. "Can you ride?" he asked instead, and watched relief flood across her face so quickly she almost forgot to school her features back into that carefully neutral mask. "Yes, sir. Been riding since I could walk." "Can you rope?" "Well enough." "Can you keep up and keep your mouth shut and do what you are told without asking 1,000 questions?" "Yes, sir." Phineas drained his coffee and tossed the dregs into the fire, watching them hiss and steam. "Pays $30 for the whole drive. We leave at dawn. You fall behind, we do not wait. You cause trouble, you are gone. Understood?" "Understood. Bunkhouse is over there. Grab whatever space is left and get yourself settled. We have got a long road ahead." He watched her lead her horse away, noting the slight hitch in her step that suggested worn-out boots and probably blisters, and wondered what kind of desperation drove a woman to take such a foolish risk. The cattle drive from Virginia City, Nevada to Sacramento was over 200 miles of rough country, scorching desert, and treacherous mountain passes, and that was assuming everything went according to plan, which it never did. They would be crossing territory where water was scarce and danger was common, where rattlesnakes and scorpions were the least of their worries compared to the two-legged predators who would not think twice about cutting throats for a few head of cattle. It was no place for a woman, disguised or otherwise, but Phineas had learned long ago that some people needed to learn their lessons the hard way, and something told him that Lou Anders was exactly that kind of stubborn. The other men drifted back to camp as the sun climbed higher, a motley crew of weathered cowboys who had worked cattle drives before and knew what they were getting into. There was Cornelius Wade, a grizzled veteran of 40 with more scars than teeth who could read the weather like some men read newspapers. Marcus Flynn, barely 22 but already hard as nails from a childhood, spent breaking horses on his daddy's ranch. Samuel Tucker and James Morton, brothers who bickered constantly but worked together like two parts of the same machine. And now Lou Anders, with her too large clothes and her too careful movements, trying to blend into the background while Phineas pretended not to notice. They gathered around the fire that evening for a meal of beans and hardtack, and Phineas laid out the route they would take. They would head west through the Carson Range, following the old emigrant trail where possible but deviating south to avoid the worst of the high passes. Water would be their primary concern once they hit the desert stretches, which meant pushing the herd hard in the early morning and late evening hours while resting during the brutal midday heat. They had 300 head of cattle to move, which was ambitious but manageable if everyone pulled their weight and the weather held. Lou sat apart from the others, chewing slowly on her beans and listening intently to every word. Phineas noticed that she had chosen a spot with her back to a large boulder, positioning herself so that she could see everyone while making it difficult for anyone to approach from behind. Smart, he thought, though it would also make the others wonder why she was so skittish. Cowboys were suspicious by nature, and anything that seemed off would draw attention she could not afford. "You ever driven cattle before, Anders?" Cornelius asked, squinting at her through the firelight. "Some," Lou answered, keeping her voice level and low. "Mostly worked ranches, moving stock between pastures." "This ain't moving stock between pastures. This is 300 head of ornery beasts who would rather run off a cliff than go where you want them to, through country that wants to kill you 6 different ways before breakfast." "You sure you are up for it?" "I am here, aren't I?" Cornelius grunted, apparently satisfied with that answer, and went back to his beans. Marcus studied Lou with open curiosity, but said nothing, while the Tucker brothers ignored her completely, more interested in arguing about whether it would rain before they reached the mountains. Phineas watched it all with the practiced eye of a man who had managed crews for 15 years, noting the dynamics and filing away information for later use. They turned in early that night, bedding down under the stars with their saddles for pillows and their rifles close at hand. Phineas took the first watch, circling the camp slowly while the others slept, and the cattle lowed softly in their makeshift corral. He paused near where Lou had spread her bedroll at the very edge of the camp, far enough from the others to maintain privacy but close enough not to seem standoffish, and watched the way she slept curled on her side with one hand tucked under her saddle like she was protecting something. Or maybe hiding something, he thought, and felt that same curious pull he had experienced when she first walked into camp. The sensible thing would be to confront her, to pull her aside and tell her he knew exactly what she was hiding, and give her a chance to explain herself before they got too far down the trail. But Phineas had never been particularly sensible when it mattered, and there was something about the set of her jaw, even in sleep, that made him want to see how this played out. She had come this far on grit and determination, and he found himself reluctantly admiring that kind of stubborn courage, even if it was going to get her killed. Dawn came cold and gray, with a wind blowing down from the mountains that promised heat later, but brought a chill now that made everyone huddle closer to the fire while they gulped coffee and choked down breakfast. Phineas saddled his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Copper who had been with him through a dozen drives and knew the work as well as any man, and watched as the others did the same. Lou moved efficiently through the familiar tasks of saddling and bridling, her hands sure despite their slenderness, and he noticed that her horse was a compact bay mare with intelligent eyes and a calm disposition. A good choice for someone who needed reliability over flash. They got the cattle moving just as the sun broke over the eastern hills, a river of brown and white bodies flowing westward with much bellowing and dust. It was chaos at first, as it always was, with animals breaking from the herd and having to be chased down, calves bawling for their mothers, and the general confusion of 300 individual minds all deciding they wanted to go in 300 different directions. But gradually, Order emerged from the madness as the experienced hands worked the edges of the herd, guiding rather than forcing, letting the cattle settle into the rhythm of the drive. Phineas assigned Lou to drag position at the rear, where she would be responsible for pushing along the stragglers and keeping the herd moving forward. It was dusty, miserable work that put her downwind of 300 sets of hooves, but it was also where she would be least visible to the others, and he saw the flash of gratitude in her eyes when he gave her the assignment. She did not complain, just wheeled her mare around and took up position, and within an hour she was coated head to toe in a fine layer of dust that made her look like a ghost of herself. They made good time that first day, covering nearly 12 miles before Phineas called a halt in a shallow valley with decent grass and a small creek running through it. The cattle spread out to graze while the men set up camp and saw to their horses, the familiar routine soothing after the chaos of the day. Lou tended her mare with the same careful attention she gave everything else, checking hooves and rubbing down sweaty patches before seeing to her own needs, and Phineas found himself watching her more than he should have. Something interesting about the new hand. Cornelius asked quietly, appearing at his elbow with 2 cups of coffee. Phineas accepted one and shrugged. Just making sure everyone pulls their weight. Uh-huh. Well, the kid did all right today for someone who claims to have only moved cattle between pastures. Got a good seat and doesn't rattle easy. That mare of his is something special too. Noted. Cornelius gave him a long look but did not push, and Phineas was grateful for it. The old cowboy had worked with him long enough to know when to leave well enough alone, and this was definitely one of those times. Phineas was not entirely sure why he was keeping Lou's secret, only that it felt important somehow, like this was a test of something he did not fully understand yet. The days fell into a pattern after that, each one blurring into the next in a haze of dust and heat, and the constant press of moving bodies. They rose before dawn and pushed hard until the sun grew too brutal, then found shade and water where they could while the cattle rested. Late afternoon brought another push until dusk, when they would circle up for the night and set watch rotations to prevent stampedes or theft. It was exhausting work that left everyone too tired for much conversation, which suited Lou just fine, as she continued to keep herself slightly apart from the group. But Phineas noticed things the others missed, small details that painted a picture of the woman beneath the disguise. The way she always volunteered for first watch, so she could wash in the creek before anyone else was awake. The careful way she rationed her water, taking small sips even on the hottest days like she was used to scarcity. The fact that she never took her shirt off, even when the other men stripped down to their undershirts in the brutal afternoon heat, and the way she always positioned herself with her back to something solid when they made camp. He noticed other things too, less practical observations that had nothing to do with maintaining her cover and everything to do with the person she was. The gentle way she talked to her mare, voice soft and musical, when she thought no one was listening. The fierce concentration on her face when she was working rope, practicing knots over and over until her fingers bled. The rare smile that transformed her whole face when Marcus told a particularly stupid joke around the campfire, lighting her up from the inside like a candle in a dark room. It was that smile that got to him, worming its way past the careful walls he had built over the years. Phineas had spent most of his 34 years avoiding entanglements, focusing on the work and the cattle and the endless rhythm of the drives, because it was simpler than dealing with the messy complications of human connection. He had seen too many men destroyed by love, watched them drink themselves to death, or pick fights they could not win or just waste away from loneliness, and he had sworn he would never be that vulnerable. But something about Lou Anders made him reconsider that stance, made him wonder what it would be like to have someone look at him the way she looked at her mare, with that combination of trust and tenderness that suggested depths he had not allowed himself to imagine. They were 8 days out from Virginia City when the first real trouble hit. The sky had been building towards something ugly all afternoon, great towers of black clouds piling up over the mountains like a bruise spreading across heaven. And by evening the air was so thick with electricity that every hair on Phineas's body stood at attention. The cattle felt it too, growing restless and skittish, their eyes rolling white as they milled about in agitation. "We are in for it," Cornelius said grimly, checking his cinch for the 3rd time. "Might want to spread everyone out, try to keep the herd calm when it hits." Phineas nodded and quickly assigned positions, putting his most experienced riders at the cardinal points around the herd while everyone else filled in the gaps. Lou ended up on the western edge, her mare dancing nervously as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Phineas positioned himself nearby, telling himself it was strategic positioning and not because he wanted to keep an eye on her, but he was not entirely sure he believed his own lie. The storm hit like a physical blow, wind and rain slamming into them with enough force to knock his hat clean off his head. Lightning split the sky in jagged forks of blue-white fire, and the thunder that followed was so loud it seemed to shake the very earth beneath Copper's hooves. The cattle panicked instantly, 300 animals deciding simultaneously that anywhere was better than here. And suddenly, the night was full of charging bodies and desperate shouts as the cowboys tried to turn the stampede before it scattered them across half of Nevada. Phineas rode hard into the chaos, relying on Copper's sure-footedness and his own instincts to avoid being trampled. He could barely see through the driving rain, could only trust that the darker shapes around him were cattle and not other riders, and he pushed forward trying to reach the head of the stampede, where he might have a chance of turning them. Somewhere in the madness he heard Marcus shouting and Cornelius cursing, and then another voice, higher and clearer, cutting through the storm like a bell. Lou had somehow gotten ahead of the herd, her mare running flat out as she angled across the face of the stampede. It was a desperately dangerous move, the kind of thing that could get both horse and rider crushed in an instant, but she rode like she was part of the mare herself, leaning low over the neck and urging the animal faster. Phineas watched in horrified fascination as she reached the lead steers and began firing her pistol into the air, the sharp cracks barely audible over the thunder but bright enough to make the animals flinch and slow. It was enough. The leaders began to turn, confused by this obstacle in their path, and the cattle behind them had no choice but to turn as well. The stampede curved back on itself, momentum bleeding away as the animals slowed from a panicked run to a confused trot to finally a milling, agitated walk. Phineas and the others used that moment to press their advantage, surrounding the herd and pushing them into a tighter circle, voices hoarse from shouting as they slowly, painfully, brought order back from chaos. By the time they got the cattle settled, everyone was soaked to the bone and shaking with exhaustion and leftover fear. The storm had passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind a clean, washed sky full of stars that seemed to mock the destruction below. Phineas did a quick head count and breathed a sigh of relief when everyone came up accounted for, though Samuel had a nasty gash on his forehead from a low-hanging branch, and Marcus was limping from where his horse had stepped on his foot. "That was the stupidest, bravest thing I have ever seen," Phineas told Lou when he found her checking her mare for injuries. His voice came out rougher than he intended, raw with the fear that had gripped him when he saw her riding straight at the stampede. "You could have been killed." She looked up at him, rain dripping from the brim of her hat, and even in the darkness he could see the fierce light in her eyes. But I wasn't, and we got them stopped before we lost half the herd. That doesn't make it less stupid. Maybe not, but it worked. He wanted to argue with her, wanted to shake her and demand to know what possessed her to take such a risk. But the words died in his throat as their eyes met and held. There was something electric in that moment, a connection that felt as dangerous as the lightning still flickering on the distant horizon, and Phineas found himself stepping closer without consciously deciding to move. "Your mare all right?" he asked instead, falling back on safer ground. "Few scrapes, nothing serious. She is a tough one. Takes after her rider, I expect." Lou ducked her head, but not before he saw the flush creep up her neck. "I should get some rest. Long day tomorrow." Yeah, you should." But neither of them moved, standing there in the darkness with the sound of settling cattle around them, and something fragile and new stretching between them like a spider's web. It was Cornelius calling his name that finally broke the spell, and Phineas stepped back reluctantly, already mourning the loss of that tenuous connection even as he knew it was for the best. They lost a day letting everyone recover from the storm and rounding up the handful of steers that had managed to break away during the stampede. Phineas used the time to check their supplies and adjust their route, studying the maps and trying to account for the time they had lost. They were behind schedule now, which meant pushing harder in the days ahead if they wanted to reach Sacramento before the heat became truly unbearable. Lou spent the downtime working with rope, practicing throws and catches until her shoulders ached. Phineas watched her from across camp, admiring the fierce determination that drove her to constantly improve, and wondered again what had brought her to this point. Women did not disguise themselves as men on a whim, did not risk everything to join a cattle drive unless they had no other choice, and the more he observed her, the more convinced he became that there was a story there worth hearing. "You going to tell me what is really going on?" Cornelius asked that evening, settling down beside the fire with a groan that suggested every one of his 40 years. "What do you mean? Come on, Phineas. I have known you long enough to read your moods, and you have been wound tighter than a $2 watch ever since that Anders kid showed up. Either you know something the rest of us do not, or there is something about him that has got you rattled, and I have never seen you rattled before." Phineas was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. Cornelius was trustworthy, had proven that 100 times over, but this was not his secret to tell. "Let it be, Cornelius, please." The old cowboy studied him with shrewd eyes, then shrugged. "All right, but for what it is worth, whatever is going on, that kid earned my respect the other night. Took real courage to do what he did." "She," Phineas said quietly, the word slipping out before he could stop it. Cornelius went very still. "She, and that is all I am saying about it. You keep that to yourself, understand? Not a word to anyone." "Well, hell." Cornelius let out a long breath and shook his head. "That explains the bathing habits, I suppose, and the way she always sleeps in her clothes. How long have you known?" "Since day one." "And you hired her anyway?" "I hired her anyway." "Any particular reason why?" Phineas thought about Lou's green eyes and fierce pride, the stubborn set of her jaw and the gentle way she spoke to her mare. "Still working that out myself." Cornelius was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Your business. But Phineas, whatever this is, be careful. Secrets like that have a way of blowing up when you least expect it." "I know." They sat in companionable silence after that, watching the fire burn down to embers while the camp settled for the night. Phineas knew Cornelius was right, that keeping Lou's secret was a gamble that could backfire spectacularly, but he could not bring himself to regret the decision. She deserved a chance to prove herself, deserved the opportunity to earn the same wages and respect as any man, and if he could give her that for even a few weeks, well, maybe that was worth the risk. The days blurred together again as they pushed deeper into the mountains, following narrow trails that switchbacked up steep slopes and testing everyone's nerves. The cattle did not like the terrain any better than the humans did, balking at the narrow passages and having to be coaxed forward one stubborn step at a time. It was slow, frustrating work that left everyone on edge, and tempers began to fray in the heat and dust. Lou bore it all with the same quiet determination she brought to everything else, never complaining even when her mare nearly lost her footing on a crumbling trail and sent both of them sliding 20 feet before finding purchase again. Phineas's heart had stopped when he saw her go down, the world narrowing to a single point of terrible clarity as he imagined her broken body at the bottom of the ravine. But she had held on with the same stubborn courage that defined everything about her, and when she finally got her mare back on solid ground, she had simply tipped her hat to him and kept going. It was becoming harder to maintain his distance, harder to pretend that she was just another hand when every fiber of his being was attuned to her presence. He found himself positioning Copper near her mare during the day, drawn by some magnetic pull he could not resist. Their conversations were brief and practical, focused on the work and the cattle and the challenges of the trail, but beneath the surface, currents of something deeper flowed, unspoken but undeniable. They were 16 days out when they hit the desert, leaving the relative cool of the mountains behind for a blasted landscape of sand and scrub where the heat rose in shimmering waves and water became more precious than gold. Phineas had rationed their supplies carefully, mapping out watering holes and springs along their route, but nature had a way of laughing at even the best laid plans, and they discovered on the second day that one of their primary water sources had dried up completely. Next reliable water is 15 miles southwest, Phineas said, studying the map with Cornelius. But that takes us off our route by a full day, maybe two. What about that canyon Marcus mentioned? Said he had passed through it a few years back and there was a spring at the north end. That is closer, only about 8 miles east. But I do not have it on any of my maps, and if there is no water there, we will be in real trouble. Rock and a hard place. Story of my life. In the end, they decided to risk the canyon, gambling on Marcus's memory against the certainty of delay. They pushed the herd through the worst heat of the day, forcing the pace even as the cattle grew sluggish and irritable, and by late afternoon they were all parched and desperate. Phineas noticed Lou swaying in her saddle and called a brief halt, forcing water on her even though their supplies were dangerously low. "Drink," he ordered, pressing his canteen into her hands. "That is not a suggestion." She drank, throat working as she swallowed, and he tried not to notice the graceful line of her neck, or the way the setting sun turned her dusty skin to burnished gold. When she handed the canteen back, their fingers brushed, and the contact sent electricity racing up his arm that had nothing to do with the static charge in the desert air. "Thank you," she said softly, and the genuine gratitude in her voice made his chest ache. "Cannot afford to lose anyone to heat stroke. We need everyone functioning if we are going to get through this." It was a practical answer, the kind of thing any trail boss would say, but they both knew it was not the whole truth. The air between them hummed with unspoken words, with feelings too dangerous to acknowledge, and Phineas had to force himself to turn away before he did something stupid like lean down and kiss her dusty, sunburned face. The canyon appeared on the horizon just as full darkness fell, a dark slash in the desert floor that promised shelter from the wind if nothing else. They drove the cattle into it carefully, wary of unseen dangers, and Phineas sent Marcus ahead to scout for the spring he remembered. The wait felt eternal, every minute stretching out like hours as they stood in the darkness listening to the cattle low plaintively and their horses shift restlessly. When Marcus finally returned, his grin was visible even in the starlight. "It is there." Not much, but enough for the herd if we are careful about it. The relief was palpable, exhaustion and tension draining away as they moved the cattle toward the precious water. It was not much, as Marcus had said, just a small seep emerging from between two rocks and forming a shallow pool, but it was enough. They let the cattle drink in shifts while the humans refilled canteens and water bags, and by midnight, everyone was accounted for, and the camp was settled in a small clearing near the spring. Phineas found Lou sitting apart from the others, her back against a smooth boulder and her eyes fixed on the stars overhead. He should have left her to her solitude, should have respected the boundaries she had so carefully maintained, but his feet carried him forward anyway, drawn by that same inexorable pull that seemed to govern all his decisions where she was concerned. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. She glanced at him, then shrugged and gestured to the ground beside her. "Free country." He lowered himself to the sand with a groan, feeling every one of his 34 years in his aching joints and sun-scorched skin. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of camp settling for the night and the soft murmur of water over stone from the nearby spring. "Why are you doing this?" he asked finally, the question that had been burning in him since that first morning spilling out before he could reconsider. Lou was quiet for so long he thought she was not going to answer, but then she sighed, a sound full of weariness and old pain. "My father died 6 months ago. Left our ranch to my uncle because, in his words, women were not fit to manage property. My uncle decided the easiest solution was to marry me off to his business partner, a man 3 times my age who already buried 2 wives and was looking for a third. So you ran. So I ran. Took what I could carry, sold what I could not, and headed west looking for work. But nobody wants to hire a woman for anything but cooking or cleaning or worse, and I needed real money if I was going to make a fresh start somewhere my uncle could not find me. And you figured disguising yourself as a man was the answer. It seemed simpler than the alternatives." Phineas thought about that, about the courage it took to leave behind everything familiar and strike out into unknown territory with nothing but determination and a good horse. "For what it is worth, you are doing a damn fine job, better than half the men I have hired over the years. You knew," she said suddenly, turning to look at him with those green eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "You knew from the beginning, didn't you?" "Yes." "But you hired me anyway. Why?" He met her gaze and felt that same electric connection arc between them, dangerous and thrilling and impossible to ignore. "Because you had the guts to ask. Because you looked like you needed a chance. Because—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish that sentence without revealing too much. "Because," she prompted softly, "because something about you made me want to say yes." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication, and Phineas watched emotions chase across Lou's face too quickly to identify. He thought she might pull away, might retreat back behind her carefully constructed walls, but instead she reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the sand between them. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not calling me out, for giving me this chance, for—" Her voice caught, and he saw the shimmer of tears in her eyes before she blinked them away furiously. He turned his hand over so their palms met, feeling the calluses she had earned through hard work and the slight tremor that betrayed her emotions. "What is your real name, Lydia?" "Lydia Anders." "Lydia," he repeated, tasting the syllables. "It suits you better than Lou, Maybe, but Lou is safer. I know. But when it is just us, when there is nobody else around to hear, can I call you Lydia? She nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I would like that. They sat there for a long time, hands intertwined, watching the stars wheel overhead and feeling the careful walls between them begin to crumble. It was dangerous, Phineas knew, letting himself care for her when they still had weeks of hard travel ahead, and her secret still hung between them and the rest of the crew like an unexploded bomb. But he was tired of being sensible, tired of holding himself apart from human connection, because it was safer and simpler. Lydia made him want to be reckless, made him want to reach for something more than the endless cycle of cattle drives and lonely nights. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt truly alive. The desert crossing took 4 more days, each one a trial of heat and dust and dwindling water supplies. But they made it through with the herd intact and everyone accounted for. The mountains on the far side rose like a promise of cooler temperatures and better grazing, and the mood in camp lifted perceptibly as they began the gradual climb back into forested country. Phineas and Lydia continued to find moments alone, brief stolen conversations when they were on watch together or riding flank while the others were occupied elsewhere. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their pasts and dreams for their futures, and with each conversation, Phineas felt himself falling deeper into something he could not name but also could not resist. He learned that she loved to read but rarely had access to books, that her mother had died when she was 12, and she had essentially raised herself after that she had a fierce protective streak when it came to animals and a temper that could flash like lightning when provoked. She learned that he had left home at 16 to escape an abusive father, that he had worked his way up from the lowest ranch hand to trail boss through sheer determination and skill, that he was terrified of ending up alone and bitter like so many of the old cowboys he knew who had nothing to show for their years but scars and regrets. The intimacy of those conversations was more powerful than any physical contact could have been, building a foundation of trust and understanding that went soul deep. Phineas found himself thinking about a future that included her, imagining what it would be like to have someone to come home to after the long drives, someone who understood the work and the land and the fierce pull of the open country. It was a dangerous dream for 100 reasons, not least of which was that she had never given any indication she wanted the same thing, but he could not seem to stop himself from hoping. They were 23 days out when Cornelius pulled him aside with a worried expression. "We might have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The kind where James Tucker noticed that Anders never takes his shirt off and started making jokes about what he might be hiding." Samuel laughed it off, but Marcus looked thoughtful, and you know how that boy gets when he starts putting pieces together. Phineas cursed under his breath. He had known this was coming eventually, had been bracing for it since the day he hired her, but that did not make it any easier to deal with. "How much time do you think we have?" "Hard to say. Could be they forget about it, could be they start watching closer. You might want to consider telling her to be extra careful for a while." "Yeah, thanks for the heads up." He found Lydia checking her mare's hooves that evening and relayed Cornelius's warning, watching worry cloud her features. "Maybe I should leave," she said quietly. "Get out before it becomes a real problem." "You are not leaving," Phineas said firmly. "We are more than halfway to Sacramento. You have earned your pay, and I will be damned if you run off because of some gossip. But if they figure it out, we will deal with it, together." She looked up at him, surprise and something softer flickering across her face. "Together." He stepped closer, close enough to smell the dust and sweat, and something uniquely her that made his chest tighten. Lydia, I know we have not talked about what is happening between us, and maybe this is not the time or place, but I need you to know that I am not going to let anything bad happen to you, not if I can help it. Phineas, let me finish. I have spent most of my life avoiding this, avoiding feeling anything for anyone, because it seemed easier and safer. But you have turned that all upside down. I look at you and I see courage and strength, and a kind of fierce beauty that has nothing to do with what you look like and everything to do with who you are. And I cannot pretend anymore that this is just me doing you a favor or giving you a chance. This is me falling for you so hard I can barely see straight, and I needed you to know that before we go any further. Lydia stared at him, her green eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. For a moment he thought he had made a terrible mistake, that he had misread everything, and she was about to tell him she did not feel the same way. But then she was moving toward him, closing the distance between them and rising on her toes to press her lips to his. The kiss was soft and tentative at first, a question more than a statement, but when he pulled her closer and deepened it, she responded with a fierce hunger that matched his own. She tasted like dust and coffee, and something sweet he could not identify, and the feel of her in his arms was better than anything he had imagined during all those long nights of watching her from across camp. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his chest and he felt the tremor that ran through her. "I thought it was just me," she whispered. "I thought I was being foolish, letting myself feel this way about you when it could never work." "Why could it never work?" "Because I am me and you are you, and the world does not look kindly on women who dress as men and fall in love with their trail bosses." "The world can go to hell," Phineas said fiercely, tipping her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. "I do not care what anyone else thinks. I care about you, about this, about finding a way to make it work despite all the reasons it should not. You really mean that? Every word?" She kissed him again, harder this time, pouring into it all the longing and hope and desperate want she had been holding back, and he met her passion with his own, hands tangling in her short hair and pulling her impossibly closer. They were playing with fire and they both knew it, risking everything for these stolen moments, but neither of them could bring themselves to care. The confrontation came 2 days later, when Marcus finally worked up the courage to voice his suspicions. They were gathered around the fire after dinner when he cleared his throat awkwardly and looked directly at Lydia. "So, Anders, I have been meaning to ask you something." Lydia looked up from where she was mending a torn stirrup leather, her expression carefully neutral. "What is that?" "Why is it you never take your shirt off? Even when it is hotter than Hades and the rest of us are down to our undershirts, you stay buttoned up tight as a preacher at Sunday service. Makes a man wonder what you might be hiding." The camp went very quiet, everyone suddenly focused on this confrontation. Phineas saw Lydia's hand tighten on the leather, saw the flash of panic in her eyes before she locked it down and met Marcus's gaze steadily. "Maybe I just burn easy in the sun." "Or maybe," James Tucker said slowly, "there is another reason entirely." "Leave it alone," Phineas said sharply, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "What Anders does or does not do with his shirt is none of your damn business." "Actually, boss, I think it kind of is our business," Marcus said, his young face set in stubborn lines. "We have been riding together for near a month now, trusting each other with our lives, and if there is something we should know, there is nothing you need to know beyond the fact that Anders is a good worker who pulls their weight and does not cause trouble. That should be enough for anyone." "But I said leave it alone." The steel in Phineas's voice made Marcus flinch and fall silent, but the damage was done. The secret was out, or close enough that it made no difference, and Phineas could see the gears turning in everyone's heads as they put the pieces together. Cornelius broke the silence, his gruff voice thoughtful. "Seems to me that if someone wants to keep something private, that is their right. And seems to me that if that person has been working their tail off and earning their keep same as anyone else, well, maybe we owe them the courtesy of respecting that privacy instead of poking our noses where they do not belong." Samuel Tucker nodded slowly. "Cornelius has a point. Anders, you have done good work, better than good. Whatever else is going on, that counts for something." James looked less convinced but shrugged. "I suppose, still seems strange is all." Marcus held out the longest, his youthful sense of injustice warring with his basic decency, but finally he too nodded. All right, I can let it go. But if there is something we should know, something that affects the drive, you will tell us, right, boss?" "If there is anything that affects the drive, you will be the first to know," Phineas promised, and was relieved when Marcus seemed satisfied with that answer. The tension gradually eased as the conversation moved on to other topics, but Phineas noticed the way the other men glanced at Lydia when they thought she was not looking, pieces clicking into place, despite their agreement to let it drop. He caught her eye across the fire and saw the gratitude and fear there in equal measure, and knew that this was only a temporary reprieve. That night, when Phineas took his watch, Lydia joined him at the edge of camp without being asked. They stood together in the darkness, shoulders touching, drawing comfort from each other's presence. "How long do you think before they figure it out completely?" she asked quietly. "Hard to say. Cornelius already knows, and the others are suspicious but willing to let it go for now. We might make it to Sacramento before it becomes a real issue. And then what? And then we figure out what comes next. Together, remember." She leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "I am scared, Phineas. Not of the work or the danger or even of them finding out. I am scared of what happens when this drive is over and we have to go back to the real world where people like me do not get happy endings." "Who says you do not get a happy ending?" "Experience, mostly. Common sense. The way the world works." Phineas was quiet for a moment, turning over the idea that had been forming in his mind for the past week, examining it from all angles before he voiced it aloud. What if we did not go back? What if instead of returning to Virginia City, we kept going west to California and started over somewhere nobody knows us? What are you saying? I am saying that I have been driving cattle for other people for 15 years, and I have saved most of what I earned because there was nothing else to spend it on. I have got enough to buy land, maybe start a small ranch of our own. Nothing fancy, but enough to make a living and build something that belongs to us." Lydia pulled back to look at him, her eyes searching his face in the starlight. "Are you serious? You would give up everything you have built here for someone you have known less than a month?" "I am not giving up anything that matters. What matters is standing right here in front of me, and if I let you walk away because I was too scared or too practical to take a chance, I would regret it for the rest of my life." "That is crazy. That is the craziest thing I have ever heard." "Probably. But crazy seems to work for us, doesn't it?" She laughed, a sound somewhere between joy and disbelief, and threw her arms around his neck. "You are completely insane, Phineas Lawson, and I absolutely love you for it. Is that a yes?" "That is a yes. A yes to California, a yes to the ranch, a yes to all of it." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, sealing the promise between them with the stars as witnesses. It was reckless and impractical and probably doomed to fail in a dozen different ways, but for the first time in his life, Phineas did not care about being sensible. He cared about the woman in his arms and the future they were going to build together. and everything else could sort itself out along the way. The final stretch to Sacramento passed in a blur of hard work and stolen moments, the herd growing leaner and more tractable as they approached civilization and markets. The men had settled into an uneasy truce regarding Lydia's secret, choosing to ignore what they suspected rather than forcing a confrontation nobody wanted. And the camp dynamic had actually improved now that the tension was out in the open. Cornelius pulled Phineas aside 3 days from Sacramento with a knowing grin. "So, I heard a rumor you might be staying in California after we deliver the herd. Where did you hear that? I got ears, don't I? And I have been watching the way you two look at each other when you think nobody is paying attention. A man would have to be blind and stupid not to see what is going on there. And nothing. I think it is about damn time you found something worth staying in one place for. That girl is good people, Phineas. You could do a lot worse. I know. You're going to marry her proper once you get wherever you are going. That is the plan, assuming she will have me." Cornelius laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "Oh, she will have you, that much is obvious. You just make sure you do right by her, understand? She took a hell of a risk trusting you with her secret, and you repay that by giving her the life she deserves. I intend to." They delivered the herd to the stockyards outside Sacramento on a bright morning in late July, 36 days after leaving Virginia City with everyone and everything accounted for. The buyer was satisfied with the condition of the cattle despite the long journey, and Phineas collected payment with the satisfaction of a job well done. He divided the wages fairly among the crew, giving everyone their share plus a bonus for exceptional work, and watched as they dispersed into town to spend their earnings on whiskey and women, and whatever else caught their fancy. Lydia stayed with him, and together they found a quiet boarding house on the edge of town where she could finally bathe properly and change into the dress she had been carrying folded at the bottom of her pack for the past month. When she emerged from her room clean and dressed in soft blue calico with her hair washed and beginning to curl as it dried, Phineas felt his breath catch at the transformation. She had been beautiful in dusty men's clothing, but like this, with the dirt washed away and her true self on display, she was absolutely radiant. "You are staring," she said, a blush creeping up her cheeks. "Can you blame me? You are stunning. I am the same person I was an hour ago, I know. But it is nice to see you as you really are instead of the disguise you had to wear." They spent 2 days in Sacramento resting and resupplying, and on the 3rd day, Phineas went to the land office to inquire about available properties in the surrounding area. He found what he was looking for about 40 miles west, a small ranch with decent grazing and a water source that the previous owner was selling cheap after his wife decided she preferred city life. It was not much, just a simple house and barn with about 200 acres, but it was theirs, and when he showed Lydia the papers, she cried happy tears and kissed him until they were both breathless. They were married by a circuit preacher the following week, a simple ceremony with Cornelius and his wife as witnesses, and no fuss or fanfare. Lydia wore the same blue dress she had worn in Sacramento, and Phineas wore his best shirt with his hair slicked back and his boots polished, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, he felt like the luckiest man alive. The ranch was everything they had hoped for and more, a blank canvas where they could build exactly the life they wanted. The first year was hard, full of back-breaking work and setbacks and moments where Phineas wondered if they had bitten off more than they could chew. But they faced it together, drawing strength from each other during the difficult times and celebrating the small victories with equal enthusiasm. Lydia proved to be every bit as capable as he had suspected, handling the horses with a skill that impressed even the most experienced ranchers in the area. Word spread about the young woman who could gentle the wildest Mustang and train them to saddle in half the time it took anyone else. And before long, they had a steady stream of clients bringing difficult horses for her to work with. Between that income and the small herd of cattle they were building, they managed to not just survive, but actually thrive. Their first child arrived in the spring of their second year, a squalling baby boy they named Thomas after Phineas's grandfather. Lydia took to motherhood with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else, though she was back working with the horses within weeks of giving birth. Thomas strapped to her back in a sling while she went about her daily chores. Phineas worried about her overdoing it, but she just laughed and told him that women had been working while raising babies since the dawn of time, and she was not about to be the first to break that tradition. Cornelius came to visit when Thomas was 6 months old, bringing his wife Martha and a wagon full of supplies as a belated wedding gift. They spent a week at the ranch, with Cornelius helping Phineas expand the barn while Martha taught Lydia some of her favorite recipes and fussed over the baby. It was good to see the old cowboy again, good to reminisce about the drive that had brought Phineas and Lydia together, and laugh about how obvious their attraction had been even when they were trying to hide it. "You did good, son," Cornelius told him the night before they left, the two men sitting on the porch watching the sun set over the western hills. "Built yourself a real life here. I am proud of you. Could not have done it without you covering for us on the drive. Maybe. But you would have found a way. You two were meant to be together. Anyone could see that." The years rolled on, bringing more children and more challenges and more moments of perfect happiness than Phineas had ever imagined possible. Their second child was a daughter they named Sarah, who had her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn streak. 2 years later came another boy, Marcus, named after the young cowboy who had been the first to suspect Lydia's secret but had chosen kindness over confrontation. The ranch grew steadily, their reputation for quality horses spreading throughout California and bringing customers from as far south as San Diego and as far north as the Oregon border. They expanded the house, adding rooms for the growing family and a proper office where Lydia could manage the books and correspondence that came with running a successful business. Phineas still took occasional jobs managing cattle drives for other ranchers, but he always came home to Lydia and the children, drawn back by the pull of the life they had built together. On their 10th anniversary, Phineas took Lydia back to the canyon where they had found water during that desperate desert crossing, the place where he had first really understood that he was falling in love with her. They stood together in the darkness beneath the same stars that had witnessed their early conversations, hands intertwined just as they had been all those years ago. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Giving up the chance at a normal life where you did not have to hide who you were?" "Are you joking? This is the most normal life I could have imagined. I have a husband who loves me, children who make me laugh every day, work that challenges me and satisfies me, and land that belongs to us. What part of that should I regret?" "The part where you had to dress as a man and risk everything just to get here." She turned to face him, her features softened by the starlight and the passage of years, but still achingly beautiful. "Phineas, that cattle drive was the best decision I ever made." "Yes, it was risky, and yes, it could have ended badly in 100 different ways, but it brought me to you. It brought me to this life, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat if it meant ending up exactly where I am right now." "I love you," he said, the words as true now as they had been the first time he spoke them. "I love you more than I have words to express. I love you too, always have, always will." They kissed beneath the stars, sealing the promise they had made to each other a decade earlier and would continue making for all the years to come. The world had changed around them, bringing progress and new challenges and shifting attitudes, but their love remained constant, a bedrock foundation that nothing could shake. The children grew up strong and capable, learning to ride almost before they could walk and developing their own unique talents. Thomas inherited his father's practical nature and his mother's way with horses, eventually taking over much of the day-to-day training work as Phineas and Lydia grew older. Sarah surprised everyone by showing an aptitude for numbers and business, modernizing their record-keeping and expanding their customer base through clever marketing. Marcus was the dreamer of the family, always looking toward the horizon and wondering what lay beyond. And at 17, he announced his intention to explore the territories to the north. Phineas understood that restlessness, remembered his own youthful need to see what was over the next hill, and gave his blessing even though it broke his heart a little to watch his son ride away. Lydia cried but held it together until Marcus was out of sight, and then she buried her face in Phineas's shoulder and let the tears flow while he held her, and promised that their boy would come back to them when he was ready. And Marcus did come back, 3 years later with a wife of his own and stories of adventure that kept the family entertained for weeks. He settled on a piece of land adjacent to the original ranch, building his own house and starting his own herd, and gradually the Lawson holdings expanded into something approaching a proper ranching empire. On the evening of their 25th anniversary, Phineas and Lydia sat on the porch of the house they had built together, watching their grandchildren play in the yard while the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Thomas's twins were racing each other around the barn while Sarah's oldest daughter tried to teach the younger ones how to braid rope, and the sound of childish laughter floated on the evening breeze like music. "We did all right, didn't we?" Lydia said softly, her head resting on Phineas's shoulder and her hand clasped in his. "Better than all right. We built something real here, something that will outlast us and carry on for generations. You ever think about that cattle drive, about how close we came to never finding each other?" "Sometimes. Usually when I am counting my blessings and trying to figure out what I did to deserve this life. You gave me a chance when nobody else would. You saw past the disguise to the person underneath. You chose to trust me and protect me and eventually love me, and that made all the difference." Phineas tightened his arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer. "I knew from day one, you know. The moment you walked into camp with that carefully practiced swagger and those eyes that could not quite hide how scared you were. I knew exactly what you were hiding, and I hired you anyway because something in me recognized something in you, and I could not let you walk away. I know you knew. I think I always knew that you knew, if that makes sense. But you gave me the dignity of pretending, of letting me prove myself before we acknowledged the truth, and I will always be grateful for that." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars began to emerge in the deepening blue of the sky. The grandchildren were called inside for supper, their voices fading as they trooped into Thomas's house, and gradually the ranch settled into the peaceful quiet of evening. 25 years, Phineas marveled. Feels like yesterday and forever all at once. 25 years of building and growing and loving. 25 years of facing challenges together and celebrating victories together. 25 years of being exactly where we are supposed to be. Here is to 25 more. Lydia laughed, the sound as musical as it had been when she was 21 and dressed in dusty men's clothing, trying so hard to be something she was not. "I will settle for whatever time we are given as long as we are together. Deal." The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow, as is the way of life. Cornelius passed away at the age of 72, and Phineas and Lydia made the journey back to Nevada for the funeral, paying their respects to the man who had helped make their happiness possible. Martha followed him a year later, and they mourned the loss of the couple who had been their first real friends in this new life they had built. But there were happy times too. Sarah married a banker from Sacramento and gave them 4 more grandchildren. Thomas expanded the horse training operation and began breeding a line of working horses that became renowned throughout the West. Marcus's ranch prospered, and his children grew up with the same love of the land that had driven their grandfather to take a chance on a mysterious young woman dressed as a man so many years ago. On Phineas's 65th birthday, the entire family gathered at the original ranch house for a celebration that lasted 3 days. Children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren filled the house and spilled out into the yard, and the sound of laughter and music and good-natured arguing was the sweetest symphony Phineas had ever heard. He stood on the porch watching the chaos with Lydia at his side, and felt such a profound sense of gratitude that it brought tears to his eyes. "What are you thinking about?" Lydia asked, noticing his expression. "About how one decision, one moment of saying yes instead of no, led to all of this. About how lucky I am to have spent my life with you. The luck was mutual, I think. Maybe. But I am the one who got to watch you blossom from that scared young woman hiding behind men's clothing into the incredible person you are today. I am the one who got to be your partner through all the ups and downs. I am the one who gets to grow old with you and know that every day for the past 30-plus years has been better because you were in it." Lydia wiped at her eyes, laughing even as the tears fell. "You are going to make me cry at your own birthday party. Good tears, I hope, the very best kind." They stood together watching their legacy play out before them, 3 generations of Lawsons carrying forward the values and dreams that had brought Phineas and Lydia together on that dusty cattle drive so long ago. The ranch that had started as a desperate gamble had become a thriving enterprise. The love that had bloomed in stolen moments between a trail boss and his disguised ranch hand had grown into something deep and enduring that would outlast them both. As the sun set on that perfect day, Phineas pulled Lydia close and kissed her forehead, breathing in the familiar scent of her and feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. They had been given something rare and precious, a love that transcended the boundaries society tried to impose, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection, a life that was exactly what they had both needed even when they did not know they needed it. "I love you, Lydia Lawson," he whispered against her hair. "From that first morning when you walked into camp with more courage than sense, to this very moment, to whatever comes next, I love you. And I love you, Phineas Lawson, my trail boss, my husband, my partner, my everything. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible, for believing in me when I could not believe in myself, for building this beautiful life with me." The party continued around them, but they stood in their own bubble of contentment, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and made something beautiful from the chance they had been given. The Wild West that had brought them together was fading into history, replaced by railroads and telegraphs and the march of progress. But the love they had found endured, as constant as the mountains and as endless as the desert sky. Years later, when Phineas finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Lydia held his hand and whispered the story of their meeting one last time, reminding him of the cowboy who had known her secret from day one and said nothing, who had given her a chance when she needed it most, who had loved her completely and without reservation for more than 40 years. And when she followed him 2 years later, her children gathered at her bedside to hear her final words, which were simply this: "Find someone who sees you, truly sees you, and hold on to them with everything you have. That is the secret to a life well lived." The ranch continued for generations after that, each new Lawson adding their own chapter to the story, while honoring the legacy of the couple who had started it all. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right across the western hills, you could almost hear the echo of laughter from a dusty cattle drive, the sound of two hearts finding each other in the vast wilderness, and the whispered promise of a love that would never truly end.